So the whole precept for this is like, when you were 21, my age, is like, how did you consume all the forms of media available at that time? So the first thing I'll ask is, how much did you consume, or what did you consume most in a given week? And it's like when you were 21.
Okay, so if I go back to when I was 21, I was probably a senior in college. And we're talking about huge changes that have occurred since I'm so old, since I was a college student. TV, of course, had been around for a long period of time, and yet in dormitories and universities throughout the United States, for instance, as a college student, when you wanted to watch TV, you went down to a common place where there was a single TV in front of, and so 35 people or 40 people would be sitting there.
That doesn't happen anymore.
The whole idea of having a TV in your room, just didn't exist then.
Yeah.
It started to come not too long after that, I suppose, but that in itself measures how different things were. What I also remember in college is that almost everyone had a radio, and so radios were on, up and down dormitory hallways, and you would hear people's radios as you walked past each door, and so the way that one got the news, or the way that one listened to, sports events or what have you, was as much through the radio as through making special trips to some room downstairs where everybody was. It was great to do because there was a social aspect attached to it on the college level. Now this is different from the home level, but on the college level, there was a tremendous amount of wit and joking and people interrupting, and how college students are. You had to have patience if you really wanted to watch something. You probably weren't going to get much quiet, and concentration there, but you went more for the fun of it as much as for any other reason. A lot of people went there to watch football games on a Sunday afternoon, or what have you. So in that sense, I suppose, as a student at a university, I would have spent what percentage of a single day? Probably not a whole lot. I mean, I might have used the radio for background. I was interested mostly at that time in my life. I really liked classical music, so I might have used classical music as background music if I wasn't studying in silence. But everyone had their favorite TV shows, and so those people went and watched. But I'll bet the amount of time that I actually spent watching TV at that time was very small, probably less than.
Did you spend more time reading then?
Yeah, much more in terms of studying, preparing classes, writing papers, and all of that. Much more time reading. And of course, you didn't have access to always having earbuds in your ears or any of that. You weren't doing that.
I mean, just the way people read books now is totally different.
Yeah, true enough.
Yeah.
Especially with the accompaniment of noise to reading books. I mean, I had to read in silence, so I read in my room, and even noise in the hallways would easily distract me, that sort of surface noise. And so you tried to, and that's why people would go to the library in droves, and the library would be, compared to now, it would seem to me on any given night relatively full, whatever that meant, because people would go there to find their quiet places.
I'm making sure it's recording, in which it is. So,
good.
So would you say then that literature was your most, like books, magazines, anything you could read was most important, and why would you say that?
I probably read, in terms of, I'm thinking of family and the kinds of magazines, I mean, there wasn't the plethora of magazines then as there are today.
Okay.
Now there are a million. But, typical American families in my era, would probably have Time magazine and Life magazine, and I think there was something called the Post magazine. A lot of people Reader's Digest, which is a magazine of cartoons and jokes and short stories and shortened novels, abbreviated novels. And so those would be a lot of what I would read in addition to all the reading I was doing as a college student.
Okay.
If I were home at the time, which was sort of going home and being with parents, the pre-marriage, then I would have probably, I used the library a lot. I would get books when I was young. I remember most of the books I got were some sports related.
Okay.
And then, as I became a little bit more sophisticated, then I would pick up novels and
you read the hell out of those?
And I would read those also.
Yeah. So did you not, by the time you were my age, did you read any sort of literary journals then, or not really?
Well, when I did, I would do it not for relaxation, I don't think. By the time I was your age, I was reading literary journals in relationship to doing papers, to writing papers for scholarship.
Gotcha.
Since I was a literature student, then the requirement was pretty steep to incorporate critical research into that which you're doing.
Now
so it's the way you're sort of introduced to journals, the way that the academic world opens up to you in a really complicated way. Of course, then, in order to find a journal, you had to go to the stacks in the library, and you had to use the library card system. Which was extremely elaborate, which a lot of people love doing. But I had to, if I was doing something on Melville, I had to go to a stack, find the MEs in the stack of thousands of drawers, pull out the ME, every card for every book. On Melville was in there. If I knew the title of the book, I had to go down alphabetically to find out where it was. Then once I found that book, I had to copy down the number, which was on that card, and then go to the place in the stacks which corresponded to that number. That's how everyone had to find that which they were doing. So we, one takes for granted the progress that we've made. It's phenomenal.
I know.
And you had to do it in the library. There was no place else to do it.
No, of course.
And you hope that your library had that particular journal.
So was that something you were just, absolutely dependent in the context of college situations?
Yeah, you in terms of developing a scholarly paper, you either had to resort to, usually in my discipline, you couldn't use sort of the flip magazines that were real casual in their approach. You had to get into something that had depth to it. So you became quickly familiar with those journals that were especially applicable to literature. And there are some still today. The publication of the Modern Language Association, PMLA, published an annual bibliography of all of the articles published on each significant writer the previous year. So I could look up in the 1975 journal all of the articles published on Hawthorne the previous year. And I would see the list, and I would see where they were all, in what journals they were. Then I had to find out if I could get any of them to see if my library happened to have that. We didn't have calling other libraries and have them mail it into this library. That pretty much didn't exist. You had to travel to that library. So if I found out, if I'm you at John Carroll and I found out that the journal I'm looking for, which is a great article that I really want to get, is in a journal that only Case Western Reserve has, I have to get on the bus. I didn't have transportation. I didn't have a car. I had to get on the bus and go down to Case and find it. And I couldn't take it out because I wasn't a member of Case, so I had to do my research in their library.
Jesus! That's a lot of work. That is a lot of work. I would not survive that way.
It was different.
Well, I'm sure it definitely was. Oh my. I think that's it for now.
Let me just review for a minute one of the dramatic moments in my life. I was an undergraduate when John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Oh, which year?
That would have been 1963, right? He was killed on November 22nd, 1963. And so we were, as a campus, and this happened in campuses all over the United States, the shock of that,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But the way you heard it was on the radio.
Yes.
So that there would be just literally hundreds of students surrounding a particular room where somebody had the radio on loud, listening to every dramatic moment of that unbelievable weekend. I mean,
Wow.
it was, that moment has sort of been called the birth of modern TV because although modern TV was much used, the news vehicle through television matured almost at that moment, because everything that related to the assassination, the killing, the recordings, the visuals, the assassination of his assassin,
Yeah.
the next day, and then that amazingly dramatic funeral where everybody, the emotions were so deep on in the student body, in the world. Really, it was probably the event that parallels 9/11. In modern American media, where everybody needed to devour it again and again and again.
Yeah.
And so you just kept watching it and watching the tapes of it, and of course it was mostly black and white TV.
Yeah.
Back then.
That's a lot. But yeah. So when I used this interview that we're filming, I had to make a peer comparison to me today, where
Your world.
my world, because that's the only world I really know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So.
Well, and I would think that, if you just try to imagine the absence of all that you now take for granted. I mean, Google is our library today.
Yeah, pretty much.
It is our library.
Especially Google.
Any fact that we want is almost instantly available to us.
Yeah.
And although we have to double check the reliability of some of the facts we find on Google, the ability to, in the old days when people would buy $600 versions of the Encyclopedia Britannica hoping that it would be their form of knowledge at home, where you looked something up because it was in one of these 20 volumes of an encyclopedia. Now encyclopedias don't even exist.
No.
There used to be door-to-door encyclopedia salesmen who would sell these beautifully bound books, and you could get them for $600 with a cheap binding and $1,000 for a fancy leather binding, that you would have in your home, and which really would be obsolete language within a couple of years, or obsolete information in a couple of years.
Wow.
Because it's old information compared to progress. And so, but now that issue of information becoming stale or old is
Seconds.
is seconds. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always current.
I'd pare down Google even further in terms of academic research down to Google Scholar. I mean, that's a big thing. And then, of course, the Griselli library databases.
Yes.
So
Right.
that even makes it even simpler.
And you have instant access to them online,
Yeah.
so that you can be in your room using your library's databases.
Yeah, I actually don't use that because I don't own a computer in my dorm. I just
Yeah.
rely on library computers.
Yep.
Much easier to do that for me.
Yep.